Here we are, the Twa Auld Heids, Mike Fenwick and Dave Lewellyn. We've been joined today by man of the hour, Mark Hirst, former STV broadcaster, worked for 4 SNP representatives, including Fiona Graham and Sandra White, and former editor-in-chief of Sputnik News. So I dare say some people would say he's one of Putin's puppets.
Not the first time that's been said.
I just got it in before anybody else did. Anyway, welcome to the Twa Auld Heids.
Nice to see you guys.
Yeah.
Afternoon, Mark. Afternoon, Dave. You picked a theme for this, Dave, and reference to Sputnik News is maybe a way of bringing the theme in, which is how we see the press and how we see their interaction with what we call the state. And I suggest that we try and maybe start off. We know what we think the press is, whether we're talking about journalists or columnists, whether we're talking about printed press or whether we're talking about broadcast. Let's define the state, however. Mark, from your background and using Sputnik and RT as examples of where state may be involved, how do you see the state when we're discussing this?
Well, I would start off by saying one of the big things is my experience. Although I've been accused of being, I think Malcolm Rifkin once said that he described me as Putin's man, the former British foreign minister. But the reality was, in actual fact, we had amazing editorial independence. Obviously, I ended up being editor-in-chief at Sputnik. But the kind of, occasionally you would get stories coming through. Sometimes there would be suggestions on what events to cover. One of the most interesting ones, which we did not do, because Sputnik UK was both an international news organisation. I don't work for them, incidentally. I left last June. But we did online news copy and also produced a daily 2-hour radio programme. And but one of the proposals that came through was they were quite interested in having a radio special on the international chess championships in London. And I thought it was a joke, actually, because they wanted us to do a kind of radio special over the 3 days of this championship. And I said, I don't know how chess on the radio is going to work, guys, you know. So that you would get ideas like that, but generally we were left to our own control. In fact, there was far more editorial freedom there, even when I started off as a broadcast journalist for them, than certainly than I ever had at STV. Although I have to say, I worked with STV North based out of Aberdeen, and in all honesty, they were a great team up there. Obviously, that used to be Grampian Television, and although it's all part of STV today, the cultures are still very different in the editorial rooms, and pretty much STV North is still Grampian Television, and they have a very strong focus on local stories and that kind of thing. But getting back to your point on in terms of the state, I mean, the state has a huge vested interest in the coverage of itself. And obviously, historically, the British state in particular, has had a very sinister, you might say, connection with certain favoured outlets. Primarily, I'm thinking of the Times. I remember a story. Phil Knightley, a very famous award-winning journalist, wrote a book called The First Casualty, basically looking at how media works at times of war and conflict. And he wrote a very interesting piece about how the UK Foreign Office had basically worked hand in glove with the Times newspaper to deploy undercover intelligence officers under the guise that they were investigative reporters or correspondents. The most famous one, of course, was Kim Philby, who was supposedly a Times reporter, but not obviously he was already working for the KGB as a double agent. So they've done it for a long time, and I have no doubt they're doing it now.
So when you mentioned about the different places under the ITV network, while I was researching this program, I noticed Peter McMahon for Borders.
Yeah.
He seems to have two sources, and the sources seem to be David Mundell or Alistair Jack, and it's the only two he ever quotes. And yet, almost every day on Nicola's on the daily update is on almost every day, and usually he's got a quote. I've noticed the difference in the different parts of the ITV network. The way it's
the interesting thing with Peter McMahon, though, obviously he came from the Scotsman, but prior to that he was special advisor to Donald Dewar. So you're very much part of the cosy club for sure, you know. But these people cross over. I mean, there's very little. You know, they all. This is one of the problems. I think a major problem that certainly in terms of the political correspondence, the political media, and the politicians are way too close. They have been for a long time. When I started off at the Scottish Parliament back in 1999, and I remember that when it first struck me, actually, the back then, of course, the Scottish Government was called the Scottish Executive. Yeah. And there was a briefing getting carried out. There's a parliamentary briefing for the press journalists. And I remember when they all came out as I was walking past this room, and I heard they were all huddled together, and I heard one of them say, "Okay, what's our line? What's our line?" And they all huddled around so they would all come up with the same line. And this was so that they weren't out of step. That if they didn't want to be writing an angle to the story which was radically different from the way everyone else was writing it. And that's a huge problem. I mean, I was shocked when I heard that, but you can see it all the time. I mean, I've seen it many times with, you know, like how the news agenda is fixed. You know, how is it, for example, in this country, most of the time you see the same headlines virtually all the time. They're always looking to see what their competitors are doing and to make sure they're not out of lockstep. In fairness to the National, I'm not a huge fan of the National particularly, but they tend to go out on a limb when it comes to their lead story, which is all credit to them. But there's not enough independent thinking in mainstream corporate journalism.
I scribbled down some notes before Dave asked me to get my brain round what we're going to talk about. One of the things I put down that ties in with what you were talking about, Mark, is the fact that there's something in Westminster called the lobby.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the Times, because of the inside story in one Sunday paper, got excluded from it. But that's part of the problem, is as a journalist, you're relying on the ability to gain a story from somewhere.
Yeah.
And if you're then debarred from being provided with the essence of that story, even if it is repetitive across the board, that is power being exercised at that level.
And it's happened, it's got worse and worse actually over the years, and it's all about access. I mean, I don't think there's an active conspiracy. I don't like the word conspiracy generally anyway. I think it's a loaded term, but there is definitely a lot of groupthink goes on, and also an understanding between the political journalists and the politicians that they have a vested interest together. And this means that, as I've kind of termed it, the cosy club continues. They don't ask the hard questions that need to be asked. And even in terms of access, I mean, UKIP did it fairly rigorously. In any events that they held, they would routinely bar the Mirror, the Daily Record, any media that they thought was leftish and, you know, too far away from them. They wouldn't be allowed access to anything. But the Tory party did it, and I have to say the SNP did it. They were doing it much more. I was a victim of that myself. Because obviously I've been critical of the kind of leadership direction for a long time. And the last time when I was working as a broadcast journalist, before I was promoted as editor-in-chief, I tried to secure media accreditation at the SNP annual conference and was denied it. And I'm a fully accredited journalist. So I was barred from that simply because of my known views and critical views of the leadership.
It's like recently about, if I've read it correctly, about getting the backing of your own trade union.
Yeah.
How much is that involved when media is denied access? Do unions try and force through an issue if someone's being denied access?
They can make representations. I mean, these events, I mean, the media accreditation, I have an official, what's called, everyone knows, a press card, which is recognised by police and right across the UK. So that is technically allowed, it technically gives me access to sensitive events. I'm going to be covering Craig Murray's hearings, for example, coming up. But as well as that, certainly the political parties, when they're running their own private events, essentially, they can decide who attends and who doesn't, whether or not they've got a press card or not.
Okay,
and,
so if you fall out with the PR spin doctor for a party, that's the problem.
That's it, and yeah, you're just you lose access basically. That's the issue there. Now that shouldn't really happen. I mean, it's a big problem in terms of our democracy, and I think this is where the power base has kind of shifted. I think historically the press had a far bigger role as the fifth estate to challenge politicians. But as these organisations have kind of got, I wouldn't say media savvy, but they've become more obsessive about controlling the message, and they've brought in people who have been ruthless in terms of making sure certain journalists don't get access. And the outcome of that, of course, is you don't actually get genuine balance then. I've always said we don't live in a properly functioning democracy unless we have a population that is properly informed and educated. And you can only allow that by allowing the politicians to be scrutinised. At the end of the day, it's taxpayers pay for them. You know, they have a duty to everyone, and if the conduit for that is the corporate media, then they have an obligation, I would argue, to engage with them at all times. We see Channel 4 all the time. They are continually asking for a minister to come on, and I think they're up to 15 or 16 refusals now. They just refuse to engage, and I think it's because they've taken a view, these political parties, that they can bypass them either through social media or because there's so many kind of mainstream media organisations that can get their message out on other platforms.
So if you go back to a younger Mark Hirst, right, starting out in the career, and the first thing I'm guessing that you might do is to say, right, I need to establish connections here so I can get access to and go back to the editor with something worthwhile. Can you tell me how that worked back in the day?
Well, it's like contacts are the central aspect of how good you're going to be as a journalist. So you have to culture relationships. Obviously, you have to do that. My argument would be that you always do that on a professional level. So there's an understanding that I was always courteous and polite to anybody, even when I was interviewing Tories, believe it or not, I would be very courteous and polite to them.
Stop the programme, Dave.
I mean, I interviewed Malcolm Rifkind. I've interviewed Nigel Farage, and although I loathe their politics, it was on there's an element, if you go in quite hostile. I think I spoke to Leslie Riddick about this many years ago. She had a persona of being very robust, very hard, and very critical of politicians. But I remember once she did mention to me the difficulty with that was that it meant that everyone she engaged with automatically made an assumption with her that was the way she was going to be. Yeah. And so I think she was an excellent journalist. Actually, I think she was one of the better mainstream corporate journalists that we had. However, she was effectively cut out. She was kind of, I think, done over by senior people at the BBC. But that's another story for another show. But
I used to be one of the people when she was on BBC Scotland Radio. Loved listening to the shows she ran, Mark. And I used to email. It was back in the day of email rather than social media per se. Yeah. I used to email in questions for the next show that was coming up. Right. As a result of which I used to sometimes be phoned or contacted by the programme producer saying, we've got someone coming on. Have you got a question for him? And she was absolutely excellent in that. And I've always missed that show. Yeah. For the very reason she wouldn't let anyone escape without answering a question.
That's right. And she knew how to ask a question. I mean, that's one of the things, these daily briefings that we get. And I mean, there was that ridiculous one, that reporter from the Sun at the press briefing with Nicola Sturgeon just a few weeks ago.
Are
you cancelling Christmas, First Minister? I mean, for goodness sake, we're on track for having 100,000 dead in the UK, and there, it was, and I thought it was despair. And no wonder the ratings have dropped. It's but there is a problem. I mean, we don't have journalists out there. There are a few exceptions. I mean, there's a number of journalists that I can think of that I genuinely greatly admire. People like Jeremy Bowen, Alan Little, Lise Doucette. I think these are Kylie Morris from Channel 4 as well. I think she's an excellent reporter. But on the whole, we have people who you're on about in your early days. Is there an element of sucking up to these people so you can establish the contacts? And I wouldn't say sucking, well, in my own experience anyway, not sucking up, but certainly being polite, and also given the opportunity. I mean, this was one of the key things with, certainly when we did the 2-hour daily show on Radio Sputnik, and we let our interviewees, we didn't interrupt them. On BBC Good Morning Scotland, they're constantly interrupted, especially if they're independent supporters. And I never did that. But I mean, if they went on too long, you have to interrupt people. But the key thing was to get them on. The questions were the most important thing, and nail them down on crucial elements. And they started going off, just rein them back in. But it was a different style altogether. Many of the critics of Radio Sputnik, for example, had never listened to the show. I remember we had John Sweeney. Remember the aged at the Scientologist. Well, he came to our studios in Edinburgh to do a knocking piece. It was before I took over, and I wouldn't have agreed to him coming because I knew exactly what was going to happen. But anyway, when he walked in, this shows you how prepared he was. He'd already made his mind up. He said, "Where's the television cameras?" And I said, "This is a radio studio.
Right.
This is not a television. This is not television we're doing." And he'd never listened to the show, not interested. He was there to do a knocking piece, which is exactly what he did do. And so, yeah, most of the critics that you tend to find, David Lease, another one, never actually listened to the content. Because I mean, you asked about the.
Can I reverse the question for you, Mark? That's you, young and upcoming, making your contacts, not sucking up to anyone. Reverse the position. There's a politician like John Sweeney who wants to come on and do something. How do they make their contacts with the press? Who do they choose?
Well, it depends what message it is. Because if it's a kind of positive thing, then they'll the way media management.
Laura Kunsberg, for instance, will get her sources.
Could you repeat?
I was using Laura Kunsberg as an example.
Yeah.
Okay, of obviously being contacted by the high ups when they want a story dealt with in a particular way. Maybe I'm not saying she'll comply with everything she's asked to do, but she'll come very close at times, if not go overboard.
Yeah. Well,
I'm just wondering how politicians choose the journalists they want to favour.
Yeah, again, that's part of the relationship. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. I think you will build up closer relationships with certain journalists that will give you fair comment. For example, I placed a lot of stories with Robbie Dinswoody at the Herald when he was still there years back, when the Herald was a semi-decent newspaper back then.
Okay.
Off the rails, and although Robbie, he wasn't there as a stenographer. I understood he had a job to do, and that he had to report it fairly. And because I've worked both sides. I've worked the media management side. It was public relations. I worked in primarily. Most people go the other way. They go from journalism into public relations. I went against the tide and paying the price for it now. But
surprised me.
But the point being was, there were certain people you would go to who you knew at least would handle the story fairly. You weren't looking for necessarily favourable coverage, but you were certainly looking for someone that wouldn't spike you. Basically, it depends on the type of story. If it's a reactive story, there's something bad news comes out and you're having to react to it. I see this all the time actually with young PR people. They'll put out a massive screed, a big story. that obviously, well, from my mind anyway, that demonstrates they don't understand how the media operate. If they're coming to you for a reactive statement, you'll be lucky to get 2 sentences in. So you need to make them quite punchy and not give them a screed of like a big backstory or anything like that. On positive stories, generally you would try and place them with someone that you knew. But even then, the relationship, I always kept entirely professional. I didn't go out socialising with these people, and similarly when I worked on the other side, when I was doing the journalism, I kept the lines very, very separate. Interestingly enough, Kevin McKenna had a really interesting piece in the Herald. You may have seen it. I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago, in which he said it was vitally important to have that, that divide. You shouldn't be going to, the birthday party of a child of a politician that you're going to have to scrutinise the next week.
Yep.
And I saw Ian McWhirter say more or less making the same point as well. And yeah, you can be friendly, you can be polite, but there has to be that professional divide. And I don't think, in the interest of accountability and genuine transparency, you can't have those sides. You can't have those 2 sides mixing.
It's funny, Dave and I Dave did a post to preview this discussion, and I posted on about having an informed population dependent on information coming out.
Yeah.
The main source in the past, I go back, my age will tell on me, Mark, with some of the comments I'll make, but going back to when there was a local paper in Prestwick where I grew up. I'm a Glaswegian, but I grew up in Prestwick, and the town clerk had a tipple every so often. The journalist would never print that because he lived next door to him, but there would be a verbatim discussion on what happened at the council meeting. So you had this fact as opposed to opinion, and that to me is where a lot of things have become very, very clouded, where opinion is being put forward as fact when it's anything but. And then the post I made to Dave is very simply, go into a court as a witness and be asked to stand in front. The first thing you'll be asked to do is to tell the truth, not just the truth, but the whole truth, and not just the whole truth, but nothing but the truth. And that seems to me to be a very missing element from all of the media just at the moment. There's sides being taken.
There's too much subjective language being used and phrases all the time, and that's the trouble. It should be genuinely objective, and I think this is another part of the problem in terms of I see it more and more. So I'm assuming it's coming through the education system, the way journalists are being trained, that they seem to have lost that ability to write in an objective way. Now, at the end of the day, there is a big question mark over what is genuinely balanced. I remember Jeremy Bowen, the BBC Middle East editor, once saying, we're constantly hearing how, for example, there's a legal requirement on broadcasters to demonstrate balance all of the time. But he says there are certain circumstances where you just can't have balance. For example, if you're in a war zone and there's a bunch of dead civilians in one corner, and on the other side of the street you've got heavily armed, drugged up soldiers who have clearly massacred these people, where do you strike the balance there? So it's about providing the context, and also the analysis. You have to give analysis, you have to give explanation to what events are taking place so that people really understand them. But the key thing to that is self-judgment, challenging yourself all the time. I do it all the time, and it really helps in terms of understanding really where you are politically. Challenge your own beliefs. Question. Sounds like an RT slogan. Question more. That is true. We need to question much more. Question yourselves. Question those around us. Because only by doing that can you really articulate the arguments that will persuade people at the end. So, yeah, we need to.
Is everyone up for persuasion? I'm thinking of a list that Stuart Campbell did on Wings recently, where he was talking about the circulation of papers in Scotland, with the Herald and others having withdrawn details of their circulation. I often wonder if the Sun is the most read paper in Scotland. I often wonder how much people actually want to be informed.
Yeah, well, people buy newspapers for. I remember when I worked in political PR, if you like, in terms of stories, the priority was always to get out on broadcast. So, for example, if you buy a newspaper and you can flick past the story, whereas on broadcast, if you're watching the news, there's a sequence of stories that you have to watch to get to the one that you're actually really interested in. So it has much more influence and reach. So I never bothered about it. There's an old saying, or there used to be in public relations, that there's very seldom a thing called the killer blow in terms of reputational damage. So there's very seldom a story that will basically blow you out the water. It's the constant drip of negativity that does the reputational damage ultimately. And on the converse of that, similarly, when you're trying to persuade people, there's not a killer blow out there. You know, it's like a giant rock that you have to put your shoulder to. And the whole, if you're thinking about the independence movement, if you're wanting to push it in a certain direction, everyone has to kind of put in a little bit, and you might only move it slightly, but eventually it'll start building up its own momentum and in the direction that hopefully that you want it to go.
You kind of see that from Trump, make America great again, or from Brexit.
Yeah.
Simple 3-word messages which are repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. Doesn't take any brain power to think it. You just listen and absorb.
Yeah, I mean that's part of it, and but there has to be a bigger intellectual argument behind the slogans. The slogans are fine for capturing people in, saying, well, I mean, in some ways we came across it recently. I mean, it's probably the one thing Boris does. It's probably the only thing that Boris Johnson does well is able to give these 3-word slogans, you know, like "stay alert" or, you know, but the essence of, you have to get to the essence of all these things and challenge them, and that's why the media's role should be very, very important, to scrutinise people, to really get at what they're at, because without that, then you don't have an educated and informed electorate, and in my view, you don't have a functioning democracy.
Yeah.
So it's a fundamental element that the media should play. And at the moment, unfortunately for them, trust in the corporate media is at its lowest levels. That's why you're seeing circulation falling off a cliff, as it was always doing anyway. It was always on a downward trajectory. But that's being replaced by social media. And the mainstream media journalists, especially some of the old-timers, absolutely hate social media. David Leask loathes social media. He's on it. He's never off it himself, but he actually hates it. You know, he hates it. And,
Paris Courtianis, for the Scotsman, he went absolutely crazy because Broadcasting Scotland has got a question on the daily briefing, and he went absolutely mental on it. And it's like it became more of the story than the Broadcasting Scotland had actually got a question.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's this sense of entitlement that well, look, we're in the, as you put, the cozy club.
Yeah.
And we don't like these young and I mean, basically, I mean, Scotland's got the national, but they've got no video media at all. Well, not official that have ever got to that stage.
It's generally, it's quite it's resource intensive. I know that you know, like it's one of the reasons we could do with something regular. The BBC tried to, they were really responding to this crisis. You know, the BBC Scotland channel that's been set up, and I think partly the ratings are horrendous. I don't know if they've improved. The last time I looked about a month ago, they were pretty shocking. And I think that's because what they've done is they've realised, oh, we're not reaching that kind of particular demographic. How do we sort it? Give them more Scottish programming. But there's more to it than that, you know. I mean, it's one of the big failings, actually, the broadcast media in Scotland. I know you're from Prestwick originally, Mike, Glasgow.
I'm going to stress Glaswegian.
But the broadcast output in Scotland generally has been overly Glasgow-centric. I mean, there's some fantastic stories happening up in the northeast, out in our rural communities. Dundee, all my family, apart from me and my brother, who are Fifers, the rest of them are all Dundonians. But there's some amazing stories happening in that part of the world and in Fife. And but the kind of onus and all the resources, of course, are based in Glasgow. And I think that's a real pity. And I think if they had addressed that a long time ago, then you wouldn't quite see some of the backlash that they get.
Dave, I'm feeling as though I'm dominating this, but let me follow up on that. Dave and I had a wee discussion a while ago, right? And I said, look, I'm kind of tired of hope over fear. I want action over hope. So let me pick you up on that. Yeah. Fiona Graham up in Orkney,
yeah, I know.
And some of our fellow people up there just said, right, okay, we'll run the Orkney News. We've got Independence Live now trying to do Independence Live radio. We've got Gordon Ross in a car and we've got David McGuinness in a lorry. What's the chances that there is enough talent within the Yes movement to set up a virtual broadcaster, whether it will be within inverted commas social media, but actually just sit down and say, here are facts that are happening, and you're referring to Dundee, it could be Aberdeen, it could be Skye, with the problems of hoteliers and people coming there in caravans, etc. What are the chances, and I'm speaking to an ex-editor of something who's got the savvy to understand what I'm asking, as a social enterprise, not as a profit-making organisation in itself, that we could actually do something like that, not in opposition to the National, but to actually garner the talent that we have available within the Yes movement, because it is there.
Definitely, yeah. The talent's there. The talent's not the talent's not the problem. The problem in terms of broadcast output. I mean, there are ways. Obviously, broadcast equipment is, most people now, even with a fairly decent mobile phone, you can produce some amazing films. And my other background was in documentaries. Yeah. And I've seen some amazing productions come out where people just filming with a very simple equipment, low cost equipment, but producing amazing content. I suppose what's lacking is a kind of central hub or someone driving it to bring that together. You would still need, like at the end of the day, there has been little startups happening every now and again. You see them popping up and they don't go very far. It's simply because it takes a lot of time to produce broadcast output. I'll give you an example on radio. Obviously, I did a lot of radio production, but compared to broadcast, what most people would recognise as broadcast quality output, it takes almost 3 times more, sometimes even more time than that, an effort to produce 5 minutes of TV broadcast compared to radio content. In fact, you could probably do radio content even at lower cost than that. So it's resource intensive. That's the problem. And people at the end of the day, they will only start engaging with it properly if the quality is there. What we're doing just now is absolutely fine because the audience that you have is used to that. They don't have an expectation that this is going to be like the One Show, for example. Or have that. So where you're overlaying with pictures and you've got breakout reports and that kind of thing. Yeah. You see? So there's an expectation on the audience, and I think if you're bringing that in, the other thing is it's because we've been indoctrinated to think like this. Is attention span. It's because we live in instant communication. People are always looking at their phones. I think long form debates like this are very, very important for informing people, but you've already got to have captured them with the kind of short form stuff first. So on the issues.
One of the reasons I raised this, and it struck me, I later at night I tend to catch up on American news programs just to find out what's going on briefly. And one of the guys that did a theme on The Real Hero at what happened with George Floyd was that video of the policeman kneeling on his neck was taken by a 17-year-old girl who was actually challenged by the police as she was doing it. And it's that type of thing that I think that it's not attention span. it's fundamentally important, and that comes from just being an ordinary individual citizen. So my theme is basically, if democracy depends on the press, and we can't depend on the press to the extent that we need to, we've got to find another way of bringing that out.
Yeah.
And if all we've got in the independence movement is yes people, then in some way, shape or form, we've got to try and find a way of organising that.
I agree. And one thing I would say, though, is just in terms of as a kind of more technical question rather than anything else, if for that format to work, so you had, say you would have to start off quite small anyway, so it might be you dedicate yourself to doing a 2-hour news and current affairs thing from all over Scotland. But all of those citizen journalists, if you like,
yep,
would have to be trained to understand what the format, the style guide is, because there's nothing more jarring for an audience than to have one kind of format and then have it, so there has to be some coordination of, right, guys, this is what we're going to be doing, but this is the kind of content you need to be providing. So you need an editorial control over that. So it's not a question, and that becomes difficult then when people are providing their time, on a voluntary basis of saying, well, this is what I want to do. Well, it has to fit, within that schedule. Otherwise, you don't retain an audience that way. That's just.
So that's where you get to the power of the editor.
You need editorial. It's not control as such, but making sure that the style, the house style, if you like, is consistent all the way through, because your audience is only going to come back if they know what they're expecting to come back to.
Yeah.
So, for example, your show, for example, people know when they log in what to expect. You see, which is fine, and you wouldn't.
I'm glad they do.
But if you change the format dramatically, like every week, people would drop off because people would think, I don't know what the hell it's going to be. You know what I'm saying? There has to be a consistency of format, which you only really get with kind of having some editorial oversight of it. So.
We're going to have to stop getting these guests, Mike, then, because they're just used to 2 years.
We don't always agree, Mark. This is the importance of this.
Well, that's good. That's a good thing.
All right, so regarding like the Dominic Cummings thing, and the way that he seems to run the press office and Downing Street, and obviously with his favourite political editor at the BBC. I noticed earlier on Twitter this week that Alistair Campbell was getting quite upset about the influence that Dominic Cummings seemed to have on Laura Kuenssberg, and I thought myself, that would be an interesting one to put to Mark.
Yeah, well, that again, it comes back to she has a very influential role in terms of editorial news output. It's not just her own packages. I mean, she's having oversight over the political correspondence at the BBC as well, and the kind of stuff that they're putting out. So it's, you can see how Cummings, for example, would want to nurture a relationship like that. I think actually probably the relationship is closer between her and Boris Johnson than it is with Cummings, simply because Cummings is, from all accounts, I've never met him, but apparently he's quite an abrasive, difficult character to work with. So, it's one of these difficult things. There are exceptions, of course. I mean, Andrew Marr, I'm not a big fan of Andrew Marr either, but I mean, he kind of typifies this kind of cozy club relationship. Remember a few years ago, there was a big controversy after he managed to secure a super injunction covering up the fact that he was having an affair with a colleague in the room. That super injunction only applied in England, of course, didn't apply up here. But I thought it was quite revealing about his journalistic mind, if you like, that he could even contemplate that, because he would be probably jumping up and down if the subject of a news story for him had served a super injunction on him. Just as an aside, I remember actually on the night of the independence referendum, I was going into Ingleston to report on events there, and Andrew Marr and his wife, this was after the scandal broke, but they were walking just in front of me as we entered into the back of the Ingleston arena to go through security. And the policeman there stopped him and he said, "It's okay, Mr. Marr, I know who you are, but I'll need identification from your bidey in," you see. So anyway, so she's a journalist as well, so she produced a press card, and they both walked in. And of course, he walks with a stick now because of the stroke that he had. But I produced my press card, and I just happened to I caught up with him quite quickly, and just at the point where I heard her say, "Andrew, what's a bidey in?" And he had to say it's a kind of mistress or girlfriend or something like that. Very awkward moment. But I mean, again, like, I think some of his questioning, especially with conservative, you can see it as if you work in journalism as a profession, you have done for a long time. You can see how he's letting certain people off the hook. His follow-up questions are generally very poor, but that's when he does them. I mean, so yeah, that's the problem we've got. We've got people who are just too close to the establishment.
That brings me back to socialising between the press, etc. Your point about Kevin McKenna saying don't go to the kid's birthday party.
Yeah,
that takes you away. But I want to go back to phone hacking. There's a certain number of people on social media in Scotland at the moment seem to have taken a liking to Piers Morgan.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting saying, no, wait a minute, he was in charge of phone hacking. That then takes you into Andy Coulson.
Uh-huh.
That then takes you into David Cameron. That then takes you into Rebecca Brooks. And that, to me, is the epitome of what can go badly, badly wrong with everything that happens within the Cozy Club.
Yeah. Well, they get away with it. It's like, I'm not suggesting for a moment they're serial killers, but it's that kind of same mentality. They get away with these things for so long, and they also, by that point, I mean, Piers Morgan will have done it, but they build power relationships with the people they're meant to be holding to account, which are so comfy that they think they're untouchable.
Right.
And you see that over and over again. I mean, Cummings, there's no question in fact, I don't think he's even that bothered about what the messaging is. He thinks he's genuinely untouchable. And it's not just the media operation that he's controlling. Obviously, he had to rubber stamp all of the special advisors to all of the government ministers, which is incredible. It's the first time that's ever happened. But in some ways, you might be going back to the kind of state control that, this is where we picked up the conversation, the kind of state control and attempt to influence the state that we've seen for a very, very, very long time in this country. And I remember, I think it was actually, it was Ken MacDonald from the BBC once told me, I was disclosing a story, I was working with him on a story related to the security service following a briefing that had taken place in the north of Scotland. So this is all in the public domain, by the way.
Okay.
Despite the fact that there is a defence advisory notice outstanding in relation to part of the story affecting myself. But Ken MacDonald revealed, he says, I'm not sure if we can go into this because he told me that he'd signed the Official Secrets Act when he first joined the BBC. This was the first time I'd heard this, that BBC trainees, I think all the way up until the mid-90s, were signing the Official Secrets Act before they could work. There was subsequently a story done that showed that right up until 1986, MI5 had a permanent office adjacent to BBC's Human Resources Department, and they rubber-stamped every single person coming through. So if they had any kind of communist affiliations or certainly affiliations that might be independent supporters, then they weren't promoted. If they were already in the organisation, they weren't promoted anywhere further. What a little kind of aside to that was, back then, before digitalisation and computers, their personnel files were stamped with a green Christmas tree at the top right-hand corner if they were believed to be potential subversives. So that shows you the extent of the way the state operated. I mentioned before about how the Times worked hand in glove with the Foreign Office to make sure that they had MI6 officers under the cover of working as correspondents abroad. So that's gone on for a long time, and we're seeing it again actually recently. One of the big stories we worked on, and ended up being quite a controversial one, was the extent of this integrity initiative, which David Leask was up to his ears in, as was Stuart MacDonald, SNP MSP.
Yeah.
And that showed you that desire, if you like, that intent by the state to control, like properly control, meant to be independent-minded journalists exists right now. It's not something that happened with Kim Philby in the 60s or way back in the First World War. It's happening right now.
Back in July 2019, that was the day that Mr. MacDonald and Mr. Smith and Mr. Robertson decided they were going to give Leask a wee exclusive for the front page of the National and the Cybernuts.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's part of that cosy club thing, and you don't have to look very far, incidentally, to see that these individuals, they have long-standing close associations with each other. They'll socialise with each other, and it needs opening up. I mean, there is a problem. You talked about the lobby in Westminster. We have a lobby in Scotland as well, and Charlotte Street Partners, for example, which is run by Andrew Wilson, former SNP MSP. I'm not entirely sure what they're up to, but I don't see them as being hugely helpful to the independence cause, particularly. I thought the Growth Commission was outrageous.
You mentioned the crossover between being in a journalist position, going over to, say, PR. Easy example of that, tied in with whether you can influence a paper to do something for you. The most famous example of that for us who are Yes was The Vow.
Yeah.
And the editor of the paper that agreed The Vow, where is he now?
Yeah, head of press, yeah.
And that is where you definitely get, if it's not a club, it's certainly a circle that people keep going round.
Well, there is I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the parliamentary bar at Holyrood is known as the White Heather Club. And journalists and political journalists and politicians right across the spectrum, that's where they go and drink and socialise. And of course, with the mix of alcohol and whatnot, people become compromised. They say things that they perhaps shouldn't have said. But a lot of the kind of gossipy stuff you hear from in the corporate press comes from the White Heather Club. I've called it the Cosy Club, but there is actually what they refer to as the White Heather Club, which is basically the parliamentary bar. And again, I think that relationship should be ended. I don't think I'm not denying. I'm not suggesting that parliamentarians should have a drink, but I think there has to be some kind of separation, because at the end of the day, the fifth estate, the media in this country, should be holding these people to account. They shouldn't be building these relationships at all. If you want to rely on them to deliver informed, educated information to the public, you can't have it, and I think Kevin McKenna's piece reflected that. I note Ian McWhirter kind of backed that up, and it's true, So how you sort it now? I mean, we've kind of got that as the establishment. It needs a shake-up, though. But
you mentioned something earlier when I was talking about trying to set up something to do with journalism from a local perspective, whether it's broadcast or whether it's radio, whatever it happens to be. It takes you back into the situation where if you're thinking of anything big, it's got to start small. Yeah. I mean, the Scotsman didn't start off or the Herald or the Times or whatever, or the New York Times don't start off as a huge print the size they are now, or diminishing as they are now.
Yeah.
They start off as someone sitting down with a piece of paper and typing something. That's where I'm coming from. And I think there's an awful lot of talent within the Yes movement that should be absolutely encompassed into something like that. Your editorial understanding of it is better than mine, Mark, but I'm absolutely sure that's part of how the Yes movement drives forward the agenda we're all trying to drive forward.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. It should be started small and local. I think that's very important as well. So you get the kind of the full range of Yes voices right across Scotland. And I mean, what Fiona has done in Orkney has been outstanding. You know, actually before that, when I used to, because I was based when I worked for STV, I was based in Orkney.
Right.
And myself and a local photographer there, Ken Amer, we started to build. It was called Orkney News Today, Orkney News Today, and because we were both, that was our jobs. It was very difficult to secure a revenue from it, and whilst these outlets are hugely important, so unfortunately, so is making sure you've got a roof over your head, you've got food on the table. So there has to be, if it's a full-time element, there has to be some kind of funding stream for it. Otherwise, you know, certainly for the people who are doing it all the time, otherwise it's just not sustainable. And I've seen it many, many times that there's startups and people throw in, they think we'll do it for nothing for 3 months, and then by that time we'll have some kind of revenue stream coming in. And what you tend to find is after 3 months, there's no money coming in, and they can't devote the time because they've got to make a living. You know?
I'll tell you what's at the back of my mind. I mean, originally, I took no part in the original referendum. Yeah. But I woke up to what was going on and saying we're doing this the wrong way. And one of the first things I wanted to try and get involved in was live streaming.
Yeah.
Got in touch with Kevin Gibney. He taught me the basics of what I needed. And since then, I'm not the only person. There's a whole bundle of us. We're not being paid, but we'll go to the rallies or we'll go to events that are going on. And just using a smartphone, we will record what's going on. The coverage you get from that, now, that fits into the people will watch because they know they're going to see a rally or a march. Yeah. That is the continuity aspect of it. But I'm sure that could be developed in other ways, Mark.
Yeah. I think when you're on about starting off small, I mean, it might not even be a case of, you might have an event, a specific event that you dedicate, saying, right, we're going to have this covered from our various, so for example, you might have a collective of citizen journalists right across Scotland, and all of them input in content for a specific thing. It might be once a month, or it might be at a commemoration or an event or a march that's taking place. So you have that diversions, but you have that coverage, but you have to have, there has to be some kind of editorial control, in my view anyway, to make sure that it's consistent, at the very least that the format is consistent. But how you do that effectively, I'm not sure. I'd have to. Well,
there's a discussion going on in Independence Live at the moment about trying to arrange a Zoom meeting to try and get people to look at how they live stream. I mean, we've all seen if you're heavily involved in the Yes movement, you'll know there's all sorts of people will take their phone to a march and take their own photographs or live stream it or just record it. The idea behind this is to try and get it, have a discussion on Independence Live and see if we can arrange a format of some kind, maybe through Zoom. So you start off teaching people how to use it. I mean, the number of mistakes, I've photographed marches sideways on, upside down. There's certain things you have to learn just to actually even be capable of doing it. But once you've got into that, I'm following up on what you're thinking. Say there's a particular topic. The one I would use at the moment is the demand to close the border.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of people. Now, I know a lot of people down in the Dumfries area who should take up the bridge 5 miles into Scotland and simply say, that's as far as we're allowed to travel. Why are you thinking of going any further coming up from the south? There's distinct things like that you can pick up on, which people are interested in as part of a social discourse, but you can actually then take it into a practical situation of saying, well, how is this affecting Orkney? How is it affecting Glasgow? How is it affecting anywhere in Scotland? And if you had 10 people throughout Scotland picking up on that theme, and it doesn't have to be a regular broadcast, it can be a specific theme that seems to be topical at the time.
I mean, I agree with that, Mike. I think I'd love to see something like that, but I just know, having, I've been involved in a startup like that up in Orkney where we threw everything at it. And after 3 months, not only because we were still doing the because Ken was the STV's cameraman up there, I was the reporter and producer. And so we were doing that and trying to get this off the ground. But at the end of the day, we had to, after 3 months, we had to realise, look, we were doing ridiculous hours. It was like 15, 16 hours, and there was nothing. There was no, we were getting the satisfaction of the output, but there was no money coming in. And also, this is possibly part of the difficulty, I think, with the proposal that you're saying might be people are coming in because they have a creative talent, or they want to explore that creative talent, if you like. And unless you've got a kind of editorial style guide at the centre of it, then people will naturally just go off and do their own thing. But if you're, I think, serious about sustaining an audience and sustaining the output, there has to be some kind of editorial oversight of that.
Understood. Quick question off a complete tangent. How do, given the diminishing circulation of newspapers, therefore the diminishing jobs for journalists, how do journalists earn a living these days? You were talking about revenue streams, but how would a journalist nowadays look to pay the mortgage, pay the rent, pay whatever he has to, bring up a family? How do they earn a living?
Well, in this climate and with the uncertainty ahead, I'm really not sure. I mean, you probably both saw that there was money thrown, government money thrown at some newspapers which were on the point of complete collapse. Now, in fairness, they've done that obviously with other sectors, other industries. Why I think you could justify, there is an argument to be said, why would you do it in newspapers which are openly hostile to you for their own ideological reasons? That's another debate, I suppose. But how you make it, you've just got to cut your cloth. I mean, what I did after I left STV, everyone thinks, this is another myth, but everyone thinks because you're on the television, and sometimes I would be on 3 times a week with different reports, that you're on fantastic money. You would go into a pub for a pint and go, you're the guy off the television, must be loaded, and you get speaking to them, and they would expect you to, they would expect you to be buying the pints. The reality is, because there's so many people want to do that job, that the money is terrible. It's terrible. I mean, I know people who are on state benefits as well as doing the kind of day job, as if on the TV or in radio or in newspapers. Sometimes it's not well paid. So how you, when I left STV, I was quite fortunate because I had contacts with international broadcasters and international news agencies, and I was able to approach them and work for a number of them. So I was able to spread myself right across the board, So and from that, work my way up. I mean, for all, I wouldn't say working for RT or Sputnik was a panacea by any stretch. However, we did have genuine editorial freedom to do the stories we want, go and interview the people we wanted to, and it was paid exceptionally well. It was paid almost 3 times more than you would get with the BBC or with STV. So, the money was really good. The downside, of course, is that you're almost guaranteed that you'll never work for another broadcaster again if you've worked for RT or Sputnik, because of the political climate that we are operating in. But in actual fact, if they took the time to listen to the content, they would realise there's some really talented people there, and that's probably the way to go. And again, with broadcast, obviously it was funded by the Russian government, ultimately funded by them. But they've got big pockets, and that's the thing with any news output. You rely on someone with a lot of money who can sustain it, because it's not a great revenue earner for broadcasters. Your news, this is well known already, television news doesn't bring in an awful lot of money for broadcasters. Yeah. So it's a how do you square that? If the funding mechanism could be solved, and I think that should be the starting point, at least to give the people who are going to dedicate all the time to it, at least to give them something back financially, then you would have something sustainable. But you know, better brains than me have looked at it before now and not got there.
That's cool.
Let me come back to you separately, Mark, as I try and we're having discussions, and that's all I can say at the moment. I hear everything you're telling me. There is no point starting it and building up your hopes. That the greatest worst thing you can do is to have an idea and not work through. Have a phrase which is walk the course, and the answer in this case is to sit down and say, right, 2 years from now, how is this going to look? And you've got to work out how you're going to get to 2 years from now, because everything that starts off has got a 2-year training period, a period in which it will either survive or it won't.
That's right. I totally agree with that.
So that's been a lot of interesting stuff we've had there. It'll be quite interesting for people to see what goes on in the background. So thanks very much for coming on, Mark.
No problem. Enjoyed it. Enjoyed it.
Sorry, Mark, go ahead.
It's kind of clicked a lot of memories in my own head, actually, about various things. There's a lot more I could have said, to be honest with you, and but we could maybe do that in a follow-up at some future point.
Come back.
I think you certainly gave me, and I'm sure you'll give everyone that watches, an insight into things, Mark, from a perspective that most of us won't get.
Yeah, and well, I hope so.
Can I just say to the pair of you, I know you're going to be somewhere important later this week. Take care when you're there.
Thanks very much, Mike. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Okay, that's us, guys. So, I hope you've enjoyed finding out what happens in the murky underbelly of the Cozy Club, as Mark calls it. We'll talk to you later. Thanks a lot, everybody. Cheers, guys.
Ciao, Alba.
Thank you. Cheers.
All the best.